Okay, hi everybody. Putting up a video lecture today. Sorry, just get this lined up. To talk about the ideologies going on in the 19th century. We've talked about the emergence of industrialization in three phases, starting in the 1750s in Britain in its first phase, down to 1800, a second phase in the first half, basically, of the 19th century and spreading to France and Germany and the United States, and then a third phase spreading into the rest of Europe, basically, and then also to places like Japan in the later 19th century and into the 20th century. We talked about also very important the sort of revolutionary generation, starting with the American Revolution in the 1770s, and then the French Revolution, the 1780s, 1790s, other revolutions going on. Um, in Latin America, in Haiti, and Napoleon's campaigns, kind of spreading some of the revolutionary ideas into the rest of Europe. Sorry, a little bit disorderly here. So what I want to talk about now is what all this launches for the 19th century, for the 1800s, is this age of ideologies in politics. Lots of isms we're going to talk about going on through this era that are really going to shape a lot of how people are thinking about government, how they're thinking about society, and a lot of things that are going on. So a number of different directions to go in here, so a little bit of question of where to start. One thing is that you do have the emergence of a clear conservatism as one of our first isms, one of our first ideologies. I should mention, by the way, an ideology, what does that word actually mean? An ideology is when you take a worldview or a philosophy, a understanding of the nature of the world or the nature of human society, and you use that idea, that conception, in order to justify a political system or a political action you're going to take. Okay, so ideology has to have both dimensions. It's not just a philosophy or a religion or a worldview. It includes that, but that has to be translated into political action or justifying political systems or something like that, right? That's when it becomes an ideology. Okay, so anyway, conservatism. Conservatism is a reaction against the revolutionary movements. Conservatives tend to assert that the revolutions were a bad idea, particularly the French Revolution and the excesses of the terror. They'll point to, they consider revolution to be dangerous and disruptive and possibly damaging to society. Conservatives tend to emphasize tradition. In the 19th century, that's going to mean to a great extent they're going to focus on monarchy. If they're British, they might still, or from some other areas, they might still be focusing on the value of a limited monarchy, but nevertheless, monarchy is going to be what most conservatives in the 19th century are going to point to. They are still assuming some kind of a political hierarchy, some kind of a social hierarchy is a good thing that assures social order and is necessary to avoid the sort of murderous, massacres that resulted out of the French Revolution. One of the classic statements of conservatism you find in England in the writings of a man named Edmund Burke in his book Reflections on the Revolution in France, where Burke basically says that English limited monarchy did not come about in the way the French revolutionaries are doing it. He sees the French revolutionaries as having an abstract philosophy, the sort of social contract theory, and they think that they can just totally overthrow all government and all order, and then use their philosophy to invent a new government from the ground up, following the dictates of their philosophy. Burke thinks that's a terrible idea, and he argues that what's great about England and the English system is that it's traditional, that the English Parliament, that the limitations on the English monarchy evolved naturally out of the ancestral traditional rights of the English people. Their sort of freedoms that he thought went back into the medieval era, went back to, the days of the Roman Empire or something. And so what you have in English history, in Burke's view, is not revolutions like the English Civil War overthrowing the order and bringing in something better. Rather, he sees those civil wars or the Glorious Revolution of 1688 as restorations of the proper traditional English order with maybe some new innovations in order to safeguard it, but not really trying to introduce something fundamentally different or new. So conservatism tends to work that way, favors monarchy. You get a lot of rulers in various parts of Europe that are referred to as enlightened despots. These are rulers who are maintaining a conservative view of the absolute power of the monarch. They're not interested in free speech or free presses or elections or anything like that. They're very much holding on to absolute royal power. However, they also take a view of monarchy monarchy, that monarchy is created for the good of the people, that monarchs ought to be benevolent and wise and just and helpful to their people. The motto of one of them, Joseph II of Austria, is everything for the people, but nothing by the people. Right? So in other words, the common people are not supposed to govern themselves or elect a government for themselves. The monarch is to do it for them, and that's his sacred duty as ruler, is to give them good, just government. And so this model of enlightened despotism becomes quite popular. The enlightened despots, they're promoting, government reforms and more efficient government. They are promoting sort of a social safety networks. They're establishing poor houses and charities and hospitals and universities and things like that for the good of their societies. But it's all intended to remind people of the blessings that their monarch gives them, right? So that people will not question his authority. Okay, so enlightened despotism and conservatism, that's one side that you definitely see. And especially for the generation right after the Napoleonic Wars, after 1815, down into the 1830s, 1840s, you definitely have this conservative European order reasserting itself, a lot of sort of counter-reaction against Napoleon and against the French Revolution, and pushing these more traditional kind of values. Over against conservatism, you have liberalism. And one thing, by the way, you hear these words, we hear them all the time in modern politics, being conservative, being liberal. Just remember that in the 19th century, they don't mean the same thing that they do in the 21st or that they did in the 20th century, right? 21st century liberalism is very different from 19th century liberalism, and 19th century conservatism is very different from 21st century conservatism. So the words are the same, but they very much change their meanings over the generations. 19th century liberalism, this is a movement which is growing out of the Enlightenment convictions that drove the American Revolution, drove the French Revolution. Okay, so sort of trying to have a more enduring system of government that will embody those values. The particular themes you get with 19th century liberalism, on the one hand, civil rights, which mainly mean rights at law. These are things like trial by jury, so your sort of Fifth Amendment right that you can't be made to incriminate yourself, a whole number of things like that, basically, and particularly equal rights, the idea that everybody has the same rights before the law. You don't have special privileges as a nobleman or as clergy or something like that that's going to give you an advantage in a law case over, just an ordinary citizenship. So equal rights before the law, everybody's got the same protection of their life and their liberty and their property as everybody else, and nobody is especially advantaged there. So that's the sort of civil rights in one dimension. Related to that, we tend to blend it together in our modern thought, but related to that, but distinct, is political participation as a second theme of liberalism, right? The first one, civil rights before the law, equality before the law. Second one is political participation, meaning having institutions of government that represent the people, that people will be voting for. And here, the running debate through the 19th century is suffrage. Who gets to vote? First of all, can you establish representative assemblies, a Congress, a parliament, or what have you, and then also who gets to vote in it. Places like the US at its foundation, in England, for a long time in Parliament, have representative institutions, but in 1800 there's still a lot of restrictions on who is allowed to vote for representatives in those institutions, who can actually vote for a congressman. Most of the restrictions have to do with property. The assumption is that someone who is a landowner, a business owner who possesses property, who has real estate, has a stake in the community, has a certain amount of maturity and responsibility, and they are sort of the people who are going to be entitled to representation. Whereas someone who's got no property, they might be a drifter, they might not really have that same kind of stability and stake that property ownership implies. They're not necessarily reliable people to have strong political opinions or to be worth listening to. So you tend to have the tax records, property tax records, being used to gauge whether a person is over the threshold to be allowed to vote or not. Liberalism in the 19th century pushes for that threshold to be lowered. Bit by bit, you get lower and lower property requirements for people to be permitted to vote. Eventually, by the time you're getting towards the middle of the 19th century, depending on where you are, 1820s and 30s, some areas 1840s and 50s and others, gradually you see property requirements for suffrage being eliminated entirely. You get universal suffrage, where everybody's allowed to vote. That sets off the second phase of the suffrage issue, which is women's suffrage. The early restrictions had not really specified gender. It was assumed that men own, the lion's share of the property. Certainly all the major property owners are going to be men. And so it was just a given that only men would be participating in elections. In some places like the US and Britain, as you're getting into the 1830s, the property requirements become very low or get abolished altogether, and all of a sudden everybody can vote, and that means women can vote too. They own a little bit of property that gets them over the threshold, or or property is no longer required. And you get this little window for a few years in the 1830s where people are shocked to see women showing up to vote, and that's rather disturbing in the sensibility of the time. So you get actually new legislation passed in many places which create new restrictions on suffrage, saying the vote is restricted to males only. And that sets off a women's suffrage movement, going to be, again, in many countries, the US, Britain, France, etc., where women are pushing to get the right to vote back. Actually, there's a sense in which it's almost, wanting to get back to where they had been in the 1830s, that was taken away from them after they had this brief window of being permitted political participation. So women's suffrage becomes a major issue for the remainder of the 19th century, and that's going to run on down through it. The third thing, actually, well, okay, another third thing is sort of related to the civil rights and the political participation issue is going to be the issue of liberation from servitude, which takes different forms in different countries. In places like the US, that's going to mean slavery. There's not large numbers of slaves in Europe, so that's not much of an issue, but an anti-slavery or abolitionist program is going to be an agenda of liberals in the United States and countries that do own slaves. In Central and Eastern Europe, places like Austria, Poland, Russia, you still have a lot of serfdom. Serfdom had pretty much disappeared, just kind of, fizzled out in most of Western Europe by the time you're getting into the 1800s. But you still have large populations of serfs remaining in these Eastern European countries. So it becomes a liberal campaigning point, sort of one of the things they want to see, the abolition of serfdom, so people are no longer bound to the land. That tends to be something that those countries mostly have enlightened despots, and that tends to be a measure that enlightened despots will take to gain favor, is to grant a liberal reform and liberate the serfs in their various kingdoms. Okay, and then finally, I guess I don't know if that counts as a third point or a 2.5 point, but the final point on the liberal agenda would be free trade. Most kingdoms in Europe in the 18th century had run on policies that we call mercantilism. This is efforts by the governments to control trade in order to guarantee a positive balance of trade, that they're selling more stuff abroad than they're buying from abroad, so that money from abroad is coming into the country and can be taxed and goes into the royal treasury, so you can use it to hire armies and things. And you do this by a number of measures. You grant monopolies in certain key industries or certain key, goods being produced. And also you use a tariff system where you're, taxing goods coming in order to sort of discourage imports, or make sure that if people are importing goods, that money is going into your treasury from it. And kind of it's a protectionist measure to, make sure that domestically produced goods are cheaper, for the home market. And that's a way to try to control trade. Adam Smith, who actually publishes his book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776 in England, same year the American Revolution breaks out, argues that mercantilism is a bad idea. He argues that if you allow free trade, drop the monopolies, allow open competition on the market, drop the tariffs, what you then get is a free competitive market, which is going to stimulate more trade activity so that the country actually becomes wealthier in a free trade market than it would have been in a protected mercantilist system. Okay, so the idea of free trade, opening up trade, liberalizing trade, allowing merchants to trade freely without, being interfered with by monopolies, without being interfered with by tariffs, will actually wind up making the country richer in the long run. So these are the things: civil rights, political participation and suffrage, liberation of slaves and serfs, excuse me, and free trade. This is sort of the liberal agenda of the 19th century. Just by a quick, reference to modernity, I said the words have changed their meaning. You can see that modern conservatism and modern liberalism of the 21st century actually both draw on the 19th century liberal tradition, right? The free trade dimension tends to be more of a conservative kind of an issue in modern politics. The civil rights issues we tend to see as more of a modern liberal issue. So 19th century liberalism divides and, branches into what we call conservatism and what we call liberalism today. Okay, so those are two of our ideologies, the conservative ideology and the liberal ideology. Another very important ism coming along here, besides conservatism and liberalism, crosscuts both, coexists with both, is nationalism, which is really related to the revolutions and arises out of them. If you look at this sort of Enlightenment political theory about social contracts that you get from Hobbes and Locke, if you look at the American and French revolutions, they're talking about authority and government deriving from the people, right? Not being top down through a hierarchy from a king, but arising out of, equal people who have equal rights. And therefore it starts meaning, okay, what is the political community, right? What is the body, the group of people who are have sovereignty and who are generating the authority of governments to rule? If it's not going to be given by God or by tradition or from your ancestors down through a hierarchy from a king, it's got to come from the ground up, and that means you have to sort of define who the group is and who it's not. What is the unit? So the new thing that gets substituted for the old hierarchies is going to be the nation, right? The nation takes on a much more important kind of a role in the 19th century, and people get obsessed with this national idea. There's been a lot of debate over what exactly nationalism is and what it comes from and what its causes are. I don't want to go into too much of it, but basically you get this new way of conceiving of nations and how they interact with politics, which tends to group together a set of characteristics which previously had really been separate and not all tied together and seem to overlap the same way that they do in the 19th century. So the nation is thought of first and foremost as a territory, right? The nation is land. It's a certain square mileage or acreage. You can draw a border around it on a map, right? There's a great age of map making and drawing borders of where your nation is and where it isn't. So territoriality, very, very important. You have to be able to define what land constitutes your nation. Of course, land by itself is not a nation. Antarctica is land, or the Sahara Desert is land, but it's not a nation. The land has to be populated, right? Sovereignty is going to come out of the people, so you have to have a population living in this defined land. And this population all has to be one united population. It has to be a people, the people of the nation, which means you're going to think they need to be somehow an ethnic unity, right? The people of the nation needs to constitute a unit. They need to be ethnically united, all belonging to one people. And that means you're going to look for certain characteristics of them that mark them as one united ethnic people. Language is going to be the biggest one. Language, hugely, hugely, hugely important to define. Have people who speak French, people who speak English, people who speak, so on and so forth, German and whatnot. We'll talk about Germany in a minute. Language is very important. Beyond that, other areas of culture are important, which can be the religion that's practiced, the food people eat, the clothes that they wear. All these kinds of things sort of seen as the marks of our national culture, our national identity that makes us all French or all English or all whatever nationality we're saying that we are here. Okay, so territory, people, ethnicity, language, culture, all kind of, tying together in a unit. And then finally, this people, right? The whole point of this is that it's a political ideology. This people has sovereignty. They are the just basis of an independent, self-governing state, right? A nation, national governance. So independent, sovereign government also is the final crowning mark that you have a nation here. Okay, so that's the theory of nationalism, a territorial, populated, ethnically, linguistically unified, sovereign state, right? That's your nation. The thing about nationalism is that no such thing exists in reality. The nation is, in a sense, a kind of a fiction. And you can see this when you start looking at all the actual political entities on the ground that people are trying to talk about as nations. There's a huge effort to sort of try to take what you've got and the material that you have and shape it into something that looks more like a nation is supposed to look, which is never what they actually look like. If you look at a place like France, for example, nowadays we think of, France as occupied by French people, but in the year 1800, people in different regions of France had very, very separate identities and very, very separate dialects and languages that they're speaking. The people of Brittany, principal in the far northwest, are speaking a Celtic language. They're not speaking anything that resembles French at all. People down in Provence are speaking Provençal. People in the southwest of France, you've got Gascons who are speaking Basque. You've got Aquitaine, where people are speaking Languedoc. Even in the north, Normans and Poitevins and Burgundians, they all think of them as being something that's not the same as French. French means the people in northern France who live around sort of Paris, in the sort of regions around Paris, basically. But everybody else is talking differently from the Parisians, eating differently, dressing differently, very, very different culture, and don't really think of themselves as that. They're subjects, or had been before the revolution, they're subjects of the King of France, but that's different from being French in this nationalistic kind of a sense, right? Even in the 20th century, after World War II, Charles de Gaulle, war hero, became president of France, and he's famous for this sort of frustrated statement that it's impossible to govern a nation that has over 200 kinds of cheese. And what he's referring to is that every single village and valley and district across France has its own way of making cheese. You've got Neufchâtel, and you've got Gruyere, and you've got Brie, and so forth. All these different cheeses, and each of those different kinds of cheese, or different kinds of wine, your Champagne and your Burgundy and so forth. Each of those represent a different local culture that really feels just as strongly or more strongly about their local identity than they feel about being French, right? So in a situation like that, you're sort of inheriting the Kingdom of France with all the various subjects of the King of France who don't particularly think of themselves as being French. If you're a nationalist, you've got to persuade them all that they're French. You've got to make them French. How are you going to do that? A few things. One very important one, you're going to build a public school system. And the public school system is going to teach students to learn a standardized French dialect, right? You're going to take, out of all the different ways that people are talking all around the land of France, you're going to pick one. Of course, it's going to be the way they talk at Paris, and you're going to say that's standard French, that's proper French, and that's the French that you learn in school. What you learn at home, when you're talking to grandma, may be very, very, very different, but you've got your proper educated school French. The newspapers are going to be published, in that proper French rather than in the local dialect. And people reading the newspapers to keep up on events are going to pick up on this sort of language that's being, put forward as the standard French language that everybody in the nation has to start learning. You get resistance from this. People sometimes prefer speaking their local dialects, but you're going to start putting the resources of government into school systems, which are going to, in part, they have other purposes too, of course, but in part designed to promote this sense of national identity. Likewise, in the schools, you're going to get courses in, say, French history. They're going to take this area and treat it as a unit that you can teach the history of, to say we've all got a common story together over the centuries of being French together, and build up sort of national heroes, Joan of Arc and so forth, as the sort of symbolic figures of French history that people will look to as their as their heroes and part of their identity as French. You're also going to generate symbols, flags, for example, first and foremost. You start having a standard flag that gets used. Flags are very, very old, but they used to be basically the coats of arms of ruling dynasties. The King of France had his banner, his flag that would symbolize his presence and his authority. People who followed him, didn't matter what language they spoke, didn't matter where they were from. If they followed the King of France, they followed the king's banner. Now you're getting flags that don't represent the royal dynasty or the various, ruling houses of the noble families. You're going to have a flag for the nation, and you're going to start flying that on government buildings and in schools in order to use that as a symbol for your Frenchness that everybody can latch onto. National anthems become a big thing. Allegedly traditional costuming is going to be a big thing. This is when Scotland invents the kilt, for example, as part of its national identity. Prior to about 1820s, only the most dirt poor people in Scotland wore kilts. It was sort of a symbol of not being able to afford anything better. But then there's a big ceremonial event where the King of England comes to visit Scotland. The people organizing it want to have some sort of a national costume that all the leaders of Scotland will be wearing when he comes, and they basically ask, what do Scottish people wear that English people don't? And they come up with a kilt, which used to be sort of, beggars and thieves and, the dirt poor homeless people went around in kilts. But this becomes the Scottish thing, so they gussy it up and make it fancy and, make it into a fancy suit, the basis of one, and then this becomes the national costume. It's what we call an invented tradition. It wasn't traditional at all. But you come up with these kinds of symbols to promote the sense of national identity. Okay, so you can see that, where you sort of inherit a government, a consolidated political body. If you don't have a sense of nation already in place, you have to construct it by generating symbols, by, generating a standardized language for everybody to speak and trying to get everybody integrated that way. Um, the one this is going to cause, however, also various kinds of problems and instabilities. One thing that it does is it causes minorities to become a much more pressing problem, right? What do you do with people who don't assimilate? Right, minorities are going to become much more of an issue because national identity, national politics means that everybody is sort of feeling their Frenchness or whatever together. But what if you've got a population somewhere that refuses to speak the national language, pursues a different religion, has a different culture, doesn't fit in? Um, that becomes a problem, right? Um, are they really loyal? Can they really be trusted? Are they really part of this nation that we're in the process of building here? There are various measures one can take towards such minorities. Genocide would be the farthest extreme, getting tried more in the 20th century, not so much the 19th, but you could try and eliminate them by, driving them out or exiling them or something like that. More commonly, or you can oppress them and sort of make sure they're kind of contained and not becoming too influential. So sort of, make sure that they're not, having necessarily the same rights or the same opportunities as people who are belonging to the national culture get. Or you can try to assimilate them, try and get them into the national language, the national school, and sort of have aggressive efforts to nationalize them and get them to assimilate. So lots of programs to, get them speaking the national language and such. So minorities within a country, can be a problem in a number of ways. And this also poses, another kind of issue from the other direction, especially if you start looking out towards, again, Central and Eastern Europe, places like Austria and the Russians. In those areas, you've got very clearly multi-ethnic empires, right? I mean, France is diverse. The people of France, I was just saying, they feel their local identities strongly. But it's even greater diversity if you look in Central Europe. You've got this Austro-Hungarian empire ruled by the Habsburg family. And they've got Austrians who are basically German. They've got Slovenes, they've got Czechs, they've got Hungarians, they've got Transylvanians, they've got Bosnians. Some of these people are speaking one or another dialect of a Slavic language. Some of them are not Slavic at all. The Germans obviously not Slavic at all. The Magyars, the Hungarians themselves are not Slavic. There's no way you're ever going to turn this into a national, into a nation. There's just way too much of a difference, far too radically different languages. At least in France, most people are speaking, closely related Romance dialects that you can, assimilate to standard French, but it's never going to happen for the Habsburgs. And as the nationalistic idea starts to spread, people in these different areas, right, the Czechs, the Slovenes, the Hungarians, they start saying, well, we've got a territory, we can define land where Hungary is, and we've got an ethnic identity, and we've got our Hungarian folk songs and our Hungarian language and our Hungarian, food. Why don't we have our own government? Right? Why are we being ruled from Vienna by a bunch of German-speaking, Habsburg family types? Maybe we ought to have our own language. So in these multi-ethnic empires, like the Habsburg Empire, the Russian Empire, also very multi-ethnic, the Turks, the Ottoman Turks down in the Balkans, you start getting these ethnic groups having independence movements of their own, wanting to break away from the bigger empires. The Turks steadily start losing people. Greece in the 1820s, Serbia around the same time, 1820s, 1830s. Bulgaria starts to break away. You have these sort of independence movements, breaking off, creating new little countries, trying to define where their boundaries are. Of course, they also turn out to have even smaller ethnic minorities of their own inside their borders, and they're trying to assimilate them or exclude them. And those people maybe say they want to have their own government. So the 19th century marks a real destabilization of Eastern Europe, especially Southeastern Europe, the Balkan region, where sort of Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, the old Yugoslavia, where like Macedonia and Bosnia and Serbia are, Greece. The Balkan region becomes very unstable. Huge question mark. What is going to happen here? Are the big empires, the Austrians, the Turks, the Russians, going to be able to keep it under control? Is it all going to break away? Are there going to be wars? What's going to happen down there? So this nationalistic idea, on the one hand, can be very powerful for creating unity and a sense of common identity and common action. Very, very, emotionally powerful. motivator for people politically, but it also can create problems as national governments try to decide what they want to do about their minority populations, or as they try to, or as these minority populations themselves, if they've got a definite culture and territory that they can identify, start saying they ought to have that independent sovereign government of their own, right, and start having these independence movements. So really mixed bag as far as, the effect nationalism is having on a bunch of areas. Okay, let's see. So we've talked about, among these different ideologies in the 19th century, we talked about conservatism with its enlightened despots. We've talked about liberalism with its various movements going on for expanded suffrage and so forth. We've talked about nationalism. The big remain, well, actually, there's a couple of them. The remaining ones are what you call the revolutionary tradition. Now, it's kind of weird to talk about revolution having a tradition, but it kind of does. The French Revolution, in particular, had really sparks of very radical tendencies. There were people in the French Revolution taking charge who said, okay, now that we've overthrown the king, let's reinvent society entirely. A lot of them are deists. They want to get rid of Christianity completely. The church and the monarchy had been very closely aligned with each other, so they want, let's get rid of the church, secularize completely. Let's reinvent the week. Have a 10-day week instead of a 7-day week. We'll have a decimal system calendar instead of these, 12 months and 7-day weeks and all this stuff. We'll just go over to, this whole other kind of a system. Seems like it'd be more rational and enlightened that way. Throw out all the holidays of Christmas and Easter and things and bring in sort of, the day of national liberation and these sorts of things in order to sort of try to celebrate those. None of this really takes root. None of it really takes over or lasts for very long. Napoleon pretty much does away with it all. Even before Napoleon, a lot of it's been abandoned. But this idea that the revolution brings in a new era where you can totally overhaul society and start over, come up with something completely new. That is going to continue having followers who, sort of feel, okay, Napoleon lost, the first round of revolutions got betrayed and, led to the, reassertion of conservatism and monarchy, but we're not going to give up hope. We're going to keep on trying. We're going to work for a future revolution. And you get periodic revolutionary efforts breaking out. There's some in the 1820s, 1830s. The big round comes in 1848 when you get simultaneously revolutions breaking out all over Europe. There's some in Germany, there's uprising in France, there's some in Poland, there's some in Italy. Really sort of sends a shockwave right through the powers of Europe, and just, none of them really succeed. They never fully overthrow their governments or get everything they want, and they're not even coordinated. These are not all revolutions trying even to achieve the same thing. In Germany, for instance, Germany is still divided between, about a dozen or 15 different principalities. There's no nation of Germany yet. In Germany, it's a nationalist revolution. It's frustration with the ongoing power of monarchs and princes over these territories in Germany, wanting the Germans to have a nation of their own, and so this revolutionary movement trying to overthrow the local princes in favor of establishing a German nation that can stand alongside of France as an equal and have what the French have. In other areas, it's more of a working class revolution or an economic revolution, which is going to give rise to some other things we'll talk about in a moment. So, very, very different ideals and goals by the different 1848 revolutions. So there's no one common thing, and none of it really succeeds anyway, but it does sort of bring together a lot of people to discuss what should a revolution do if you do succeed, and also, of course, causes a lot of fear of revolution to spread in the ruling classes, in the governments of Europe. How are you going to prevent these revolutions from succeeding in the future? Because we had a big scare back in 1848. Okay, so what are you going to do, and how's that going to work? Well, let's not worry about it. Obviously, the conservatives are going to be more conservative. We'll talk about that in a bit. But you get these sort of revolutionary theorists really sort of pressing for ideas of revolution. They tend to fall into two major camps. The Marxists, or communists, on the one hand, and the anarchists on the other. The communists are basically basing most of their idea on the thought of Karl Marx, and you have his Communist Manifesto. We mentioned it in class. A bit lengthy compared to some of your other readings, but worth reading. Marx is quite brilliant of a thinker. What everyone thinks of, actual attempts to implement his ideas. Nevertheless, as a philosopher, he's a very, very influential thinker. Prior to Marx, people assumed that the engine driving history, the engine driving society, was basically ideas and beliefs and morals, was basically sort of mental and spiritual factors. And people tended to write history as the history of great men, sort of the great spirits who led people and, won wars and conquered empires or built religions or, whatever. History tended to be thought of that way. Marx, on the other hand, looks at history and he says he doesn't think that these intellectual and spiritual and moral things are the real forces driving society. He says you get down to the root of things and the real engine driving societies are their economies, right? Economics is the basis of all society. And Marx's basic premise is that all political systems are designed in order to protect economic interests. They're designed to sustain a system where some people have access to wealth and other people serve them. And he argues that what you see over the long run of history is a history of class struggle where the classes are defined by their economic relationships, basically between those who control what he calls the means of production, and those who work the means of production. So he thinks that if you go back to the ancient world, to Rome or Egypt or whatever, you had the owners of land, and then you had their slaves, basically, a slave society. He thinks that gives way to a medieval system, what he calls a feudal system, where you have the lords of the land, is medieval nobility, and the peasantry working the land, right? Class struggle as the peasants try to be more free and get more advantages, and the nobles try to keep the peasants under control. And Marx thought that that revolutionary generation, the American and French revolutions, were another revolt, in which the kings and nobles had been overthrown, and you have a new ruling class that he calls the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie are the people who are the capitalists. They're the people who control the new industrial economy that's emerging in the late 18th and early 19th century. He's looking at England, he's looking at France and Germany. This is kind of second wave industrialization going on. And he says this is the same people who are owning the factories, who are building the railroads, these capitalists who are investing in all this stuff. They're the old medieval merchant class. They're the old commoners who rose out of the peasantry, became a distinct class of their own. In the revolutions, they overthrew, that was the class that overthrew the kings and overthrew the nobles. Now they're in charge, and now these new kinds of government that we're seeing, these liberal governments, these democracies and so forth, and the conservative enlightened despotic monarchies in their own way, this is a new phase in which the government is designed to protect the interests of the capitalists in a rising industry. Sorry about my nose a little bit here. Okay, so that's Marx's basic idea, and he argues class struggle is going to continue. Under the capitalists, you have the proletariat, you have the workers, the laboring class, the guys who are on the factory floor, who are being exploited by wage labor for the profit of the capitalists who own the factories and the railroads, right? And that's going to mean a struggle, and that means you're going to have another violent revolution that's going to overthrow the capitalists. When that happens, the proletariat, the laborers, will take charge. And Marx argues that when that revolution happens, the only way to create stability and harmony and prevent just more class struggle and this just repeating endlessly is you have to go to the root of the economic conflict, right, that underlies this class conflict. And he says the heart of it all is private property. The fact that individuals own property privately, which means they're always in competition with each other, trying to get more of it or to hold on to what they have and to keep it away from the people under them, right? He says that's sort of the heart of all the conflict. So Marx's diagnosis is that what you need to do in order to end the cycle of revolution and the cycle of oppression that leads to revolution is you need to abolish private property and go into a new economic system and a new kind of society and a new kind of politics in which everything is shared by all members of the community without anybody personally owning anything. Okay, hence communism, community ownership of everything, right? And to Marx's view, once you do that, that's going to liberate everything. People will become equal. There will no longer be competition between people, and therefore there'll no longer be oppression, and therefore no more need for a revolution. You'll have a society where everybody is equal, everybody gets what they need. The motto he presents is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, where everybody will do their work and benefit from it, and that'll be good for everybody. One Marxist idea also that he talks about, not so much in the Communist Manifesto, but in some of his other writings, very important though, is his idea of mystification. It's an idea he uses it sometimes in there, but I think he doesn't really use the term mystification in the manifesto, but you'll notice him, if you read for it, alluding to it a couple of times, or using the substance of it a couple of times. Mystification, the idea is in a divided class society, right, with a ruling class and an oppressed class, whether it's nobles and peasants or bourgeois and proletariat or whatever. Um, he says there's always going to be um, an effort on the part of the ruling class to try to keep the oppressed from understanding their oppression, right? Ways to sort of justify it to them, to make it think that this order of things is natural and beneficial, so that they won't realize, the actuality of their oppression and rise up and have a revolution. And so he argues that things like religion, things like traditional morality, things like art and culture and ideology and just all sorts of stuff, is all part of the process of mystification, which is all really generated by the ruling class in order to perpetuate the subjugation of the lower classes. That's where a famous Marx quote comes from, that religion is the opium of the masses, right? Sort of the ruling classes use religion to keep the masses high so that they're, unaware of, the realities that they're dealing with and don't rise up. So that's Marxism, sort of calling for this working class revolution in order to overthrow things. One thing about Marxism is that because it focuses on social class, it tends to be very international in its focus, not nationalistic. And you see there's a real conflict and, attacks going back and forth between nationalism, which is the much, much more popular ideology in Europe, and communism, which argues that nationalism is just one more form of mystification, one more way to, get working class people to not notice they're being oppressed because you're getting them all excited about being French or English or German or whatever they are. The Marxist argument is you need to discard nations and instead, get people to identify with their class so that all the working class people will unite. Workers of the world unite right towards the end of the manifesto there, regardless of what their nation is, and all together work against the international capitalist hierarchy. So that's Marxism. Even more radical than the Marxists, sort of involved with them in plotting revolutions, but eventually splitting from them, are the anarchists. I'll take less time with them because this has gone on fairly long, and anarchists are even smaller and in some ways less influential. But anarchism is the idea that maybe government per se, is unnecessary. Maybe government is not something that we need to reform and have a better government, but maybe we actually, the very concept of having any sort of a authority over people is the source of oppression and is the source of evil. So the anarchists will be rather similar. They share a lot with the Marxists in that they tend to identify with the lower classes. They tend to agree that, private property and, wealth sort of getting funneled into the upper classes is a bad thing. But they tend to argue that, politics per se is a bad thing. Marxists are more willing to have some kind of a government, some kind of a state, at least for a time, maybe that would eventually become obsolete, in a future utopia. Whereas the anarchists say, what you need to start by doing is not change the economic system, you need to eliminate the government. There are pacifistic anarchists who just sort of try to opt out of contributing to the power of government in society. And you also get violent anarchists who will try to disrupt the operation of government. You get a number of them in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, assassinating world leaders. The American president McKinley gets assassinated by an anarchist. They're bombing police stations and post offices and government offices like that. Things like that, sort of to make a statement and to, attack government, to try to disrupt the actions of government. Terrorizes people. These are sort of the original terrorists in some ways. Never really succeeds, of course, in producing a government-less society. Government is still with us today. So those are sort of the revolutionary traditions. One additional ism that I'll throw in here while I'm doing the video is socialism. Socialism, in a sense, is what you get from a more, non-revolutionary order, from sort of the liberals in government, and from even the conservatives. A lot of the enlightened despots are willing to consider socialism. You can use socialism in a strictly Marxist sense. That also is a reference for Marxism. They will refer to themselves as socialists. But here we're talking about a more moderate socialism that's not so much interested in abolishing private property, but is interested in using the power of government, particularly its power to tax, in order to alleviate some of the abuses or some of the negative byproducts of the evolving industrial capitalist economy, right? As you get working classes dependent on wage labor, they're getting into a very vulnerable kind of a situation, right? Because back when their ancestors were peasant farmers, they're on the farm, and the markets might go up or down. Merchants may gain money or lose money, but you could at least grow food on your farm and generally hope to survive as long as you didn't have a bad harvest, right? Whereas with wage laborers working in the factories, if the market goes bad, if the factory is not able to sell as much goods, it might cut hours, it might start firing people. You're not working as many hours in a week, you lose wages, all of a sudden you're not able to pay your bills, and what do you do then? Or if you get fired, what do you do then? So socialist measures are ways to kind of basically build a safety net driven by the government or funded by the government in order to alleviate these vulnerabilities, and thereby a lot of it really is intended to sort of prevent people listening to the Marxists, prevent people getting interested in revolutionary ideas by reassuring them that the system works and they're not being left behind and they're not being abandoned to starve, at the whim of the capitalists or the whim of the market. So you get health insurance measures, government-provided health systems. You get sort of social security networks to provide for people who are no longer able to work, disability, sort of provisions, all sorts of things like this being implemented by by governments, sort of both liberal governments and also a lot of these sort of monarchical, enlightened despotism type conservative governments will implement these socialist measures in order to create what we call the welfare state, right? A government which is taking much more of a proactive role in the economy in order to prevent some of the vulnerabilities from leading to revolutions. That's the idea. Okay, so whole bunch of isms, whole bunch of ideologies driving the arguments of the 19th century over politics and what the nature of government is and what its role in society ought to be. To do a quick run through them, and you could go back through the video if you need to do it. You've got conservatism, you've got liberalism, you've got nationalism, you've got communism, you've got anarchism, you've got socialism. Some of these are contradictory to each other and are really diametrically opposed. Others kind of overlap. You can have a nationalistic conservatism or a nationalistic liberalism. Anybody from almost any of these groups might consider implementing socialistic kinds of measures, that kind of thing. So it's not as though these are all totally separate groups or totally separate opinions, but this is sort of the range of different points of view that you see going around in the 19th century. Okay, and we'll stop there. Thanks, guys.